Hello, this is Mark Lieberman, the host of the radio show The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina. 103.7 on your dial if you're listening to us now. Also streaming globally on WPVMFM.org. So today I have a guest who's going to try to explain everything we need to know about prescription drug pricing. And my guest is Antonio Ciaccia. Antonio, I want to thank you for being on the show today.
Great to be with you. Although you said we're going to talk about drug pricing, this is supposed to be an hour long. If we're going to learn everything we need to know about drug pricing, we probably need to schedule another 3 weeks.
Okay, well, whatever we continuously, whatever we don't cover in this hour, we will have subsequent shows, and then people can write in and get a certification if they manage to sit through all of it. So okay, so obviously I was over promising, but just a bit of an intro and then of the topic. I recently found out, and as Antonio and I discussed, I have a background as a lawyer in healthcare or health law regulation, including reimbursement, having worked for and with hospitals and physicians and clinics. Never really worked for a pharmaceutical company, obviously, but I thought I understood what I needed to know in terms of my own prescription drug costs and involvement with getting prescription drugs. And as a Medicare beneficiary, I have the privilege, I thought, of having a prescription drug program, as many Americans do, that I thought would cover the bulk of my drugs. Understood that branded drugs would, because they cost more for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into, but assuming that I could, understand and well afford the cost. And then recently I found out that I don't know anything about prescription drug pricing, because it's now really confusing and it sounds like it's corrupt, but I don't want to pass judgment. But I found that in some cases you can be paying out of pocket more than you would if you bought the drug, less than if you bought the drug through your insurance plan. And there's a lot of these so-called discount drug cards that are available, and a lot of famous people like Martin Sheen are advertising them on television. And it's just more complicated. So Antonio has a big job trying to explain it to us, but he's used to explaining it because he is a CEO for 2 companies, which I'll let him talk about, that helps to sort of understand the data and tries to explain things to businesses and others. But he's going to give us a tutorial in this, and I'll keep the conversation moving. So let me turn it back to you, Antonio. You had early involvement in the pharmacy area. You switched focus, and then you came back to pharmacy with using your business degree. So tell us first, you're coming to us from Ohio, outside of Columbus, and where these 2 businesses are headquartered.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a pharmacy household. My dad has been a hospital pharmacist up in the Cleveland area for about 40 years. He spent some extra time on the side working at an independent pharmacy. Pharmacy was good to our family. I was enamored with what he did, and initially set out to do exactly what he did. And so I started working as a pharmacy technician for a small grocery chain up in Cleveland area. Had every intent to do exactly as he did. My sister did the same. She's a Walmart pharmacist today up in Northeast Ohio. And I got to organic chemistry and said, this sucks, I'm out of here. So I switched to journalism and political science. Ended up thinking that I'd be done with pharmacy forever. Shortly after my time at Ohio State, I took a job with the Ohio Pharmacists Association, where I was running their magazine, and eventually moved my way into government affairs, which is where I really started to learn about the complicated world of drug pricing. So why is it so complex? It's because there's no such thing as price. There are many different ways that you can quantify the price of a drug at different stages within the drug channel. But anytime you have more than one price, there is no such thing as price. And so we learned that the hard way through my time at the Pharmacy Association, which we can get into later. But today, based upon what we have discovered through our longitudinal research and investigation into how drug pricing works, I launched a nonprofit called 46 Brooklyn Research, where we take publicly available drug pricing data, we analyze it, and create dashboards that make it more accessible to the general public. So our goal is purely drug pricing education. And when we launched that in 2018, we were bombarded by governments, plan sponsors, patients, provider groups, et cetera, that were somewhat enamored with some of the dashboards and tools we had given away at 46 Brooklyn. And while I had no entrepreneurial desires at the and still don't, it was very clear that there was an unmet need in the marketplace. And so I launched a consulting firm called 3 Axis Advisors in 2019, where we do work for Medicaid fraud control units, state attorney generals, provider groups, research foundations. We even do work for some transparent and disruptive pharmacy benefit managers. So we do a little bit of everything, but all centered around diagnosing dysfunction in the drug supply chain.
Interesting. What's particularly interesting to me, and hopefully the listeners, is you launched, so to speak, the nonprofit first, if I understand what you're saying. You obviously were making a living out of that, paying yourself a salary, I'm assuming.
That was all volunteer. I did it as a side, as I was working for the Ohio Pharmacists Association.
I see.
We decided to spend the hours between 9 p.m. and 12 a.m. With our laptops, crunching boring Excel sheets off of CMS's website, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and that's how we did it.
That again is even more amazing that you contributed and worked those kind of hours as your after day job, so to speak. But let me back up, because there's a lot of interesting things that you said. I'd like to follow up on it. Years ago, maybe 30 years ago, even still 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, it didn't seem to me that getting prescription drugs was that complicated from the standpoint of the consumer. And also, it seemed that you had a lot of choices, at least seemingly, because you had a lot of different brand names of pharmacies around America. Today, it would appear there's still a lot of choices, but it's a little bit of a confusing landscape, which is to say, in the towns that I've lived in the last, again, 20, 30 years, there's CVS and there's Walgreens. There are other pharmacies, but there's CVS and there's Walgreens. And
Yep.
Sometimes they're a quarter of a mile apart or a mile apart. And sometimes, I've noticed in Florida, there's a CVS and there's a Walgreens across the street. And that is very strange to me.
Yeah.
But I believe that the reason, there's probably lots of reasons for it, but the CVS and the Walgreens, and this process started years ago, don't just sell drugs. And I don't mean sell drugs on the street. They sell milk. They sell lunch meat. They sell a bunch of stuff having nothing to do with drugs. And that's, that looks like potentially an oligopoly or something with a poly at the end. but they're big players. But there are other folks out there that are involved, and you just mentioned it because now you go to your grocery store, and you go there to buy the milk, but while you're there, you can get a prescription filled, and you can get a COVID shot, and you can get a flu shot, a shingles shot, and then you can go back and pick up the other items, the sugar frosted flakes in the next aisle. But all this is sort of weird, and I don't know how the extent to which any of that contributes to the overall issues that you concentrate on, which is what's going on in terms of drug pricing. But can you speak to that, please?
Consolidation is a reality of the current marketplace from top to bottom in the drug channel. We've seen increased consolidation in the drug maker space. We've seen increased consolidation in the drug wholesaler space. Pharmacies included, pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, those that essentially manage the drug benefits on behalf of insurance companies, they have consolidated, as has the insurers as well. And so consolidation is often sold to consumers and regulators as some saving grace that's going to provide, great economies of scale that will benefit the consumer. What we typically see is that it ends up just enabling more arbitrage. It constrains, options, choice. In quality, we don't typically see, increase. In fact, you could argue it decreases, especially in the pharmacy sector. If you're a patient, in the old days, if you have a bevy of choices at your fingertips, you're going to choose a pharmacy based upon whether or not they're the most convenient, whether they provide you the highest level of care, and whether or not their prices are competitive. Today, our price sensitivity as consumers has been stripped of us because the drugs are basically covered by our employers or Medicaid benefit, et cetera. We're not really price sensitive anymore. So at least that part is gone. So it leaves customer service and convenience. And, as we've seen, as choices diminish, the quality in pharmacy, I think from a customer service standpoint, has been diminishing. And there's been a lot of articles in NBC News, at New York Times, highlighting that the pharmacy experience from a customer's perspective has really been in a state of decline due to understaffing, crappy metrics in the industry, et cetera, et cetera.
So I want to go back at some point shortly to your issue about lack of price sensitivity on the part of the consumer. I suspect that's not completely true in the sense, and things are changing, because while you have insurance, if you have insurance and your insurance company is charging you a premium and you can afford a premium, and the other expenses associated with procuring drugs, such as co-payments and deductibles, is relatively small, then you don't think about it very much. But what seems to be a growing trend, and again, my own experience sort of highlights it, is just because you have insurance doesn't mean you're still not paying and feeling the pain when you go to Walgreens or CVS or some other place to procure your drugs, and you think, oh, I can afford a $10 copayment or a $30 copayment, or in some cases, maybe the insurance pays for 100% of it. But when you go there and go through the drive-through and they say, did you know, because this is the question you get asked more often from who's ever manning the window. Did you know that your drugs are going to cost you $345 today? No. Well, they are. And that is sticker shock. And then you got to say, am I going to pay it? Is there another avenue? I can't stand in this line anymore. People are honking a horn. So I gotta just make a snap decision. So I know things are changing, and it's probably because people like myself are experiencing that. But maybe it would be best if you talk about, as you've talked before in various venues, how do prescription drugs get to the pharmacies to begin with? What is the supply chain? Can you talk about that?
So there's a lot of different ways that we could go down this road, but let's just use a more simplified one for the sake of the attention span of lay viewers and listeners. You have a drug maker that makes a drug. Think of Pfizer, Eli Lilly, AstraZeneca, et cetera. They sell to drug wholesalers. companies called McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, headquartered here in Columbus, Ohio. Those wholesalers will distribute to pharmacies, and think of CVS, Walgreens, your independent pharmacy, et cetera. And that is the chain of command as far as the actual physical inventory of the drug goes. A pharmacy can choose to purchase drugs from a variety of wholesalers, just like a wholesaler can choose to buy their drugs from a variety of manufacturers.
And just to be clear, in the case of a so-called wholesaler, in days gone by, a wholesaler would be someone or an entity that took custody, in effect, purchased the drugs at a wholesale price and then dispensed them down the line to individual pharmacies or whatever. But that's not really what's going on. I mean, I'm assuming that the wholesaler, what you call the wholesaler, is more like a broker who sets it up. Is that true or not true?
They're probably a little bit of both. I like to think of the wholesaler as the warehouse. If I'm a pharmacy, it'd be very inefficient if I was to buy my drugs from all the hundreds of different manufacturers that are out there. And so the wholesaler provides some assurity to the drug makers. The wholesaler, is representing all these different pharmacies that are purchasing drugs. And because they are selling to so many different pharmacies, they're able to use that scale to go back to drug makers and get their own discounts. The drug makers enjoy that trade-off because there's some assurance that a certain amount of product will always be turned by that wholesaler on an ongoing basis. And so it's a very legitimate market function, because on the pharmacy end, at least at that point, I don't have to go to Teva, Pfizer, and everybody else, especially in the generic sector where there's hundreds of different manufacturers. It provides some stability and some sort of it's an easier to predict flow from the wholesaler. The question then is, are wholesalers providing value relative to what they charge? And not all the time. They engage in arbitrage too. But from a functionality perspective, that supply chain, if you will, is built in I think a good alignment.
Okay, so let me reintroduce my guest today is Antonio Ciaccia, who is he runs two separate organizations which interface. One is 3-Axis Advisors, which is a consulting firm that helps to explain to various entities, including the government, or providing consulting services to government insurance programs and others. And also he is the founder of and the president of 46 Brooklyn Research. And if people want to look up those companies on the internet and find out more about it, more than what we're going to be able to discuss today, I invite them to do so. But where I wanted to pick up again is, again, in the olden days, and still presumably for that segment of the population which doesn't have any insurance that covers prescription drugs, they're the three parties you mentioned, which is the pharmaceutical company, the wholesaler, which is the middle person. I was going to say middleman, but middle person, and then the pharmacy. But in the world in which there are insurance programs, that private commercial insurance programs, government-sponsored insurance programs such as Medicare and Medicaid, there is this third entity with an alphabet part of its name, PBM, which stands for Pharmacy Benefit Manager. They came into being at some point for some specific reason, and now it seems like maybe what they're doing has changed. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so prescription drugs weren't always expected to be covered by insurance plans. And so in the old days, a lot of times we talk about community pharmacies and we talk about them as retail pharmacies. And retail pharmacies, the reason that they were named that is because they operated like any other retail establishment. You walked in, the price of the drug was in fact the price of the drug. And so pharmacies and the entire drug supply chain that behind it essentially had to compete on price and quality to entice a patient to buy a product. if the product was too expensive, the patient would choose not to buy it. Now, we might say as society that that's an unacceptable thing to happen, that a patient could not afford a medication, which is why we have things like Medicaid and Medicare and compulsory private insurance at this point. But what that used to be was a just like you would buy your gallon of milk or your box of eggs. Over time, we as consumers sought out more coverage because the medicines got more expensive. And so PBMs were brought in to facilitate the claims transaction between insurance companies and pharmacies. PBMs just very simply, back in the 60s and 70s, were adjudicators, something essentially like a Visa or MasterCard for your drugs. As our reliance as consumers on coverage grew, so too did the role and impact of PBMs in managing or facilitating that transaction. And as PBMs found themselves in the middle of more and more transactions, rather than a customer just reaching into their wallet and paying cash, plan sponsors like government programs and employers who were paying for benefits for employees said, maybe we could have PBMs start influencing the transaction rather than just approving it. And so, rightfully so, because you have drug makers who left to their own devices would charge as much as they could get away with, who sell to wholesalers who would do the same thing, who sell to pharmacies who would do the same thing. Eventually, plan sponsors started to say, PBMs, we want you to start working on our behalf to not just pay the bill, but start negotiating the bill. You know, say, we don't want to pay what the pharmacy is charging. We don't want to pay what the pharmaceutical company would like to yield on the drug. And so, as that occurred, the role of PBMs became so much more important because they were acting as a necessary friction against one end of the drug supply chain that, again, left to its own devices, would charge as much as they could get away with. Where PBMs started to get more complicated was when they started to develop business interests on the very end of the transaction that they were hired to control. And so PBMs started making money from drug manufacturers. Drug manufacturers would pay PBMs a lot of money, what we typically call rebates, in exchange for the PBM agreeing to cover the drug in the first place. PBMs started opening their own pharmacies. They have mail order pharmacies, specialty pharmacies. In the case of a company like CVS Caremark, you might know CVS as the pharmacy, Caremark is the PBM. As PBMs develop more and more business interests in the pharmacy, within the drug supply chain, beyond just processing the claim and working to make it less expensive, so too has the size of PBMs grown. Today, the three largest PBMs and their vertically integrated enterprises are now Fortune 15 companies. They are larger than the pharmacies and drug makers that they were hired to control in the first place. So for a layperson, they might say, PBM, that sounds boring and uninteresting. It's true. I get that, but recognize that if you care about drug pricing, these are the largest players operating in the drug supply chain today.
Okay, so let me try again for myself, but for our listeners to try to break this down a little bit further. So it sounds like, you know, the name pharmacy benefit manager is actually a misnomer in terms of describing what those entities do. But what you just said in terms of integration, and for those listeners who are not experts in antitrust law, you said that there in effect is both horizontal and vertical integration. So horizontal integration, again, is where, and let's not use the drug business for example, but let's just say horizontal integration is where you've got two companies that do different things and compete for the market, and therefore there's competition, and competition is considered usually to be good because it then creates incentives for the competitors to lower their prices in order to sell more stuff. When you have integration on the horizontal level, and again, going back to the drug business, you have integration in the sense that the market for drugs becomes less competitive the fewer players that you have. So if you only have 2 or 3 major players, and there's 3, I've heard the number 80%, 3 major players in terms of the PBMs, also presumably the pharmaceutical, not the pharmaceutical companies, but the interface, I guess, if that's the right word. You have less competition, but you also said vertical integration. Vertical integration, again, going back to the oil and gas analogy, is you've got Exxon, and then you've got brokers that sell the Exxon gas to the gasoline station. That's to the extent that Exxon owns not only the company that drills for the oil, but also the pipelines and also the individual gas stations. You've got vertical integration, and both of those things tend to be considered to be not good ultimately for the consumer, because it removes the levels of competition at every place in that supply system. So anyway, let you take it back to the drug situation and explain whether I've stated that accurately.
I think you're right. When it comes to horizontal integration, you have drug companies which are still the drug industry from a manufacturing perspective is actually, relatively speaking, quite diverse when you compare it to other layers of the drug channel. It's not to say there's not problems and dysfunction on the drug maker side, but from a diversity of players perspective, it is quite robust. On the wholesaler side, there are many different players. However, there are 3 large wholesalers that make up just about over 90% of all sales. That's McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health. On the pharmacy side, we're seeing increased consolidation. We're seeing less and less independent pharmacies. We're seeing more of the regional chains get swallowed up by CVS and Walgreens. Even Rite Aid, who was one of the largest players, maybe 10 years ago, has been swallowed up into some of the larger chains as well. You have the emergence of players like Walmart Pharmacy, Kroger Pharmacy, and the grocers. It's diverse, but the market concentration, at least in the pharmacy space, is heavily dependent upon where you're looking, because we expect access to community pharmacies from a physical standpoint. What we might look at as horizontal integration at let's say a national level, we might say, well, it's competitive enough. Well, the second you go into your community, if there's only one pharmacy, that's a monopoly as far as you're concerned. So diversity in the marketplace is a little bit more nuanced in the pharmacy space. When you get to the PBM sector, those that are actually covering the drugs, facilitating the process of covering the claim, we're looking at extreme levels of concentration, just like we see in the wholesaler marketplace as well, where 3 PBMs make up about over 85% of all claims transactions. And on top of that, a lot of the quote competitor PBMs are white labeling or renting certain services from the larger PBMs, providing a distorted perception of what competition actually looks like. So when we say 3 PBMs make up 85% of that marketplace, the truth is, if you're looking at it a little bit more nuanced and looking at those quote competitors, that concentration is even more significant. And then on the insurer side, we also see a growing amount of horizontal consolidation. So back to what you're saying, concentration of the markets is occurring at every layer of the supply chain. Where vertical integration creeps in is when we look at what we used to call PBMs, or used to just conceptualize as only PBMs. Today, they are vertically integrated. So let's use CVS Health as an example. CVS Health now owns Aetna, which is one of the largest insurance companies in the country. They're all one and the same. Caremark, as the PBM, is one of the largest PBMs in the marketplace. And then again, you have CVS pharmacies, which are community-based pharmacies, mail order pharmacies, and specialty pharmacies. We also see CVS in joint sourcing arrangements with companies like Cardinal Health, where they're involved in essentially the wholesale business as well. The only thing that CVS isn't technically, well, maybe I should stop before I get too far ahead, but they're not considered to be a manufacturer, except the fact that CVS white labels some of its own over-the-counter products that they sell on the front end of their pharmacies. So If you wanted to
So
be
let
technical,
me,
you
let
could
them,
argue that CVS now owns every layer of the drug channel.
okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. For listeners, white labeling means what? A branded, a product with a name that you wouldn't necessarily recognize in terms of the brand. Is that what that means?
That's exactly right. It is, some company is making something and they sell it to somebody else, and they don't represent it as the source material. They represent it as whoever purchased that product or service, they slap their own logo on top of it.
Okay. So again, for those tuning in, we're listening and speaking with Antonio Ciaccia, who is the founder and president of 3-Axis Advisors and 46 Brooklyn Research out of Ohio. 3-Axis is a consulting firm that tries to provide consulting services about the complex system that we're talking about, which is drug pricing. And 46 Brooklyn Research does some of the same thing, but they're more their existence is primarily to provide information and understanding to anyone, including individual consumers, to try to understand this. And as clear as you've been, Antonio, I'm just imagining if, and maybe you have this on one of the so-called dashboards, if you were trying to explain this to, let's say, high schoolers, and you were trying to put up some kind of a graphic description to show, how the drugs move and who the players are and who owns who, I think it would look like a bowl of spaghetti turned upside down, because it sounds like it's just that complex. Is that a fair statement to make?
Without question. I have a bias against complexity because in my line of work, the reason that people hire us is to primarily help them unravel complexity and have a better understanding of what real prices are, what fair prices are. And with mystery comes margin. And there's obviously, when you look at how large the pharmaceutical industry has gotten from the drug supply chain perspective, there's a lot of margin and it coincides with a lot of mystery. In an ideal world, I would put myself out of business because there are many companies like ours who are experts in drug pricing. There's arguably firms that know more than us. But what they do is they rely heavily on the secret sauce remaining secret. And so what we try to do is give away as much as humanly possible because we all pay for this system and it's inadequate. I think that there's a lot more that can be done to elevate the role that pharmacists play in healthcare delivery. And I think a lot of that is insulated and hidden and constrained by the fact that we throw the pharmacist within a transaction that's getting exceedingly complex. And we look at the pharmacist as a healthcare provider merely as a distributor of the drug. And so if we don't unlock, I think a lot of the fat that lives in the distribution of the drug will never actually look at pharmacy in a way that they could actually register a greater healthcare or a greater value proposition to the healthcare sector.
So, as a former healthcare attorney for 30 years, I concentrated my practice on trying to focus on other parts of the healthcare delivery system, the hospitals, the physicians, the clinics, the laboratories. In today's world, prescription drugs are playing an ever increasing part in the care, treatment, whatever, for healthcare. In other words, people still go to the hospital, they still go to visit their general practitioner, they still go to specialists for certain traumatic issues, but also for chronic care. But increasingly, drugs play a huge and part in terms of people's sense of what they need to do to get healthy, stay healthy. which means there's more and more money that's being put out for drugs. And yet it's easier to understand, it seems to me, how the healthcare system works from the standpoint of the classic providers that I just mentioned than it possibly is with regard to prescription drugs, which is playing this outside oversized role in terms of healthcare. And when you, again, going back to the PBMs, which is what we're centrally talking about, when you said PBMs were designed originally to adjudicate, what that term means, I think, from the layperson's perspective, is you go to your doctor says you should be taking this particular drug, you have insurance. The doctor doesn't really get involved in whether your insurance will cover your drug, and they simply say, which pharmacy do you go to, or whatever. And if it's CVS or Walgreens or ABC, someone in the back office of the physician's office sends that script electronically or otherwise. They used to write it on paper, electronically, and you show up at the drugstore and pick it up. So the PBM was instrumental in sort of processing, like, is maybe a better word, the claim, which means, okay, doctor said that patient needs this particular drug. The insurance will cover this portion of it, or it doesn't cover it at all because of things called formularies. But it was more simple. But now, as you say, the PBM's role has enlarged, and not necessarily because it's providing a better service that benefits the individual consumer or patient, but because there's a lot of money, a lot of latitude, and a lot of things that are going on beneath the surface. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, without question. It has been made unnecessarily complex because that's where arbitrage can occur.
And by arbitrage, what do you mean by that?
Arbitrage is essentially taking advantage when somebody takes advantage of an asymmetry of information in order to mark something up. So if I'm basically hiding the price on one side, hiding the price on another side, and making sure that I'm taking advantage of the gap.
Okay. So let me ask you this question. Your company, you're a smart guy, your company's very capable. It's trying to develop, trying to make something that's very, very complex, less complicated in terms of the discussion. And you also provide services to healthcare entities of various sorts. I think one big question that comes up is whenever you see that there's consolidation, when there's referrals, we call them rebates if we're being nice, we call them kickbacks if we're not being nice. The government has a role to play, or is supposed to have a role to play, which is to say, if those rebates are actually more in the nature of kickbacks, which we can talk about the difference between what those two things mean, the government says we need to stop that. And the government has an important interest to play, particularly with, obviously, with Medicare and Medicaid, because Medicare and Medicaid is shelling out money. Yes, it's taxpayer money initially, but they're shelling out money. And if there are inefficiencies in the system that are, either out and out fraud or just simply loopholes that people are exploiting, you would think the government would want to get involved in a variety of ways. Has government taken an active role? Does government need to do more to try to fix or address the problems?
Without question. I think there is, I'm somebody who's leery of a heavy hand of government, but, government has an unquestionable role in this. As a perfect example, you could argue that some of the problems were created by government in the first place. Years ago, PBMs and insurers, in terms of their relationships with drug makers, were granted an exemption to the federal anti-kickback statute. And so there are federal laws on the books that say that in other marketplaces, kickbacks are expressly prohibited because they are anti-competitive. The drug industry got a special exemption for it. And so what that meant is that large drug companies would go to insurers and PBMs and say, hey, in exchange for you covering our drug, and maybe even not covering a competitor's drug, we're going to give you a ton of money as an enticement for you to make that decision. And so now we as consumers who are relying on insurance companies and PBMs to cover the expensive medications have been at least corrupted from an incentive perspective. Not completely, because I'm not saying that they're picking drugs just based upon how profitable they are, but they're going to make decisions that are now going to be swayed by financial enticements that are given by drug makers. What makes that even more broken in the drug industry is that recognize that drug makers don't lower their prices in the face of competition at this point. In traditional marketplaces, competition works to lower the prices of said products and services. However, in the drug industry, now that there is an exemption to the anti-kickback statute, what that means is that drug makers can raise prices higher and higher and higher in order to accommodate larger and larger rebates and discounts back to PBMs and insurance companies in exchange for coverage. What that does to us as consumers is it creates a price that becomes almost unrealistically unattainable without having insurance and PBMs to cover that product for them. So it's created a captive marketplace for us as consumers, because drugs are no longer priced with the intent of a consumer buying them. They're priced with the intent that insurers and PBMs will be buying them, and only when they receive huge discounts in exchange for covering it in the first place.
So I got a couple of questions. First of all, one would assume that if there's a discount to be had, that somehow the benefit of that discount would pass down to the consumer. I mean, after the usual administrative costs are paid for. But the discounts, what you're saying is that the discounts are actually money that is available to all the players up the line, essentially, to make them even more profitable because they can. Is that what you're describing?
You're correct, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Most patients pay very little or nothing for their medications, right? But there are others, let's say Medicaid patients basically pay nothing. Those who have good coverage from their employers, they may not experience any price at point of sale. However, we're seeing a growing share of patients who are in high deductible health plans. And so in those instances, if a PBM, let's say you're in a high deductible plan and I'm not, okay? We might have the same PBM. So when I am a patient and I go to the pharmacy counter to get my drugs, I will see a $0 copay, or let's say a $10 copay. And in that regard, we would argue that whatever that discounting system that exists, at least I didn't have to pay for it at the pharmacy counter. Now, maybe I'm paying for it in a higher premium, but at least I'm not exposed to an artificially inflated list price at the pharmacy counter. You might have the exact same PBM, except you're in a high deductible version of that PBM's benefits offering. Now you're walking in and you're paying the full list price of that medication, even though the PBM might be collecting a huge rebate and discount that makes the net cost for them much lower, but you're getting stuck paying the full tab at the pharmacy counter without any of the benefit of that discount coming through to you.
Well, let me stray into an area which hopefully will not cause you to cause even more confusion or complexity here. When you're talking about insurance, you have at least 2 or 3 subtopics. You've got the deductible portion. So deductible, most people understand that you have to reach a deductible. You have to have expended out of pocket an amount that's called, in effect, the deductible before you get the first dollar of coverage. And that used to be simpler because the deductible concept was applied sort of across the board. My healthcare services, I have a deductible for if I go to the hospital, I have to shell out X dollars before my insurance company will pay for my overnight stay. You might have a deductible for the physician or the anesthesiologist. But nowadays, what I'm seeing is you don't have just one deductible with a lot of plans. You might have a deductible for certain kinds of drugs, but the drugs that cost more, that somebody's evidently making a higher profit on based upon what you've been telling us, Antonio. No, you have another deductible. You had a deductible that was only this amount, but now it's higher for certain drugs. So that's another way in which people, the consumer, is paying for their drugs, and it's not covered by the insurance, even though they have an insurance plan. Then there's the so-called copayment, which is, okay, maybe you have a low deductible, but when you go to pick up the drug, 80% of it is covered through your insurance. The other 20% is what you have to pay every time you go to get the drug. Now, some people's plans are better, richer, for better for the consumer. Some of the drugs, there's no copayment, and the deductible is low, as you said. But it seems to me that, again, from what I've seen, is you have the consumer having to pony up more and more money as time goes on, and until and unless there's regulation. It's just that it's dispersed. And so in terms of the transparency of it, it's not that obvious. And I think that probably contributes to the problem as to why the situation has continued without a whole lot of yelling and screaming by patients who are being priced out of being able to get their drugs, even if they have insurance.
I would argue that this is no longer insurance. These types of phrases, I like to compare to, say automobile insurance. Okay, with automobile insurance, the idea is that you pay a premium, you pay a premium, you pay a premium. When something goes wrong, that's when they step in. Now you might still have your own deductible. Okay, you might have to pay $500 or something like that until you have to at least cover a portion of it. But the idea behind auto insurance is that, look, there's going to be a certain deductible threshold, but when something goes wrong, it will kick in. What makes drugs a little bit unique is that we expect coverage for everything, even cheap generics. It would be the equivalent of your auto insurance also covering your oil changes, nicks and dings on your car, et cetera. And so I would argue that we have insurance for something that we don't need sometimes. Generic drugs are highly deflationary. There's very little sticker shock, if at all. It's essentially an insurance policy on a deflating, good or service, which, you don't necessarily need. But put that off to the side. Most health insurance deductibles are looking at $5,000, $6,000, that you have to pay. And so that's not insurance. I buy insurance to make sure that when I see a surprise bill that I'm not necessarily ready for, I want my insurance company to insulate me from the risk of that. If my deductible is thousands of dollars, that's not helping me. That is not really insurance. So what we have today is managed care. So a lot of insurance companies or health insurance companies don't even refer to them as insurance companies anymore. They refer themselves as managed care organizations or managed care plans. And I think it's an important thing for consumers to understand that this benefit that we have isn't the insurance company or the health insurance that your mom and dad had. This is a far more complex coverage, and it is not meant to act as insurance. It's meant to just overall manage your overall well-being. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Just recognize that the incentives are different than what many people conceptualize.
I take your point, which is that the use of even the term of insurance probably doesn't make much sense when we're talking about, quote, healthcare insurance. It made sense when you said, insurance. I have fire insurance. I'm hoping I'm not going to have a fire, having a fire, having your house burned down or be damaged by fire is a relatively rare event. So, but it could be a catastrophic event. So you pay for insurance, but cross your fingers and hope that you never have to use it. But if you have to use it, then most of the expenses is taken care of. But you've already paid in advance, so there's no real surprise. In this business, the pharmacy business, the one that's now controlled by all these players who are all related and get rebates and all that. That's like you said, it's a different story. People just want somebody else to pay for it, but they don't realize in the end they are paying for it. They're paying for it through premiums, they're paying through it through deductibles, they're paying for it through co-payments, and they're paying for it through denials. Let's not forget the fact,
Right.
and again, I've seen this go up. Your doctor says you need to have this particular drug. There are other drugs we could choose from, but I'm choosing this for you because I think this will work better with your body chemistry and your other medical conditions, and there's less side effects, blah, blah, blah. So you say, great, thank you very much. You go to the drug store. I don't know if it's fair to call it. Go to the pharmacy and you hand them the prescription, or they got it, on by email or encrypted transmission. And they say, they make a call or they look at their computer screen and say, your insurance company doesn't cover this. Well, okay, what are you supposed to do? Well, you got to go back to your doctor. The patient has to go back to the doctor. They have to get on the phone, get answering, leave a voice message, wait 24 to 48 hours. And then they never talk to the doctor because they've already seen the doctor. The doctor's taking care of a new patient every 15 minutes, sometimes every 15 seconds. So you get somebody to say, okay, listen to you, I can't get my drug covered. That requires the physician's office to intervene to provide some level of information to the insurance company, which transfers it possibly to the PBM in this whole maze. And they will get back to you and decide whether or not they should make a so-called exception. And that's where, again, things are getting really balled up in the process. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so back to what I was talking about with the anti-kickback exemption. So drug makers are paying a bunch of money over to PBMs in exchange for covering their drug. That has an inflationary impact on price when that occurs. Why are they doing that? Is because the drug maker is being guaranteed some sort of market share. So if I'm a large PBM and I represent 25, 30% of all patient lives, that drug maker needs me more than I need them. And so that drug maker is willing to cough up big money in order to get access to the mouths and bodies of all those patients that PBM represents. And so the drug maker won't do that unless they're getting something very material in return. And so part of the benefit is that they're buying market share by engaging in that kickback scheme. So the PBM has to deliver on that promise of market share. How do they do that? That's by saying one drug will be covered, another one won't. Or that's by saying one drug will be preferred, the other one will not. And if a patient and a doctor think that a certain medication is better for you, well, we don't care. We're going to go off what we think is best for you based upon our own incentives as the PBM. And so one of the carrots that a PBM will throw to a drug maker is that, look, we'll prefer your drug. We'll make sure there's $0 copay. You pay us a lot of money, that's what'll happen. And then your competitor drugs, the drug companies that you don't want the patients getting access to, we're happy to slap a prior authorization on that. We're happy to go and engage in the step therapy that basically disincentivizes the physician and patient from getting access to the alternative medication that is not preferred by the PBM.
Okay, so we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to talk to you about, or have you talk about what do you think is being done, what can be done. But let me focus on one thing just to make it perfectly clear in what you said. You have a physician who spent years going to medical school, spent years in internship and residency, perfecting his or her craft. They've decided this is the drug that you need. And they've looked at the literature, they looked at the data, they know why they're prescribing it. That the choice that that physician made for each individual is being taken away from the physician, taken away from the patient, and put in the hands of people whose only interest is making more money. That sounds absolutely horrid to me and scary. So do you feel that that's horrid? And do you feel that at this point in the last few minutes of the show, that there's going to be progress made to address these issues?
So I do believe that formularies have their place in the system. Let's say for the sake of argument that there's one drug that's very good and there's another drug that isn't very good. And let's say that the good drug is also even more, it's even cheaper. So if I am a health plan, or if I'm a plan sponsor, okay, I'm your employer, I want a PBM making decisions that entice people to take the better drug that might be a better value than the less value drug. All right, all of that is important, but recognize that there is conflicts in that regard. If the PBM is making that decision, what type of skin in the game do they have? What type of incentives do they have to make sure that that's the right one, especially if they're working against the recommendations of a physician? What makes this even more, I think, horrid, to use your term, is that the prices of the medications, again, are overinflated, and we as consumers aren't expected to get that to pay for them out of our own pocket. So we have gotten to a point where drug prices have become so disconnected from reality that even if we decided to go around our insurance plan, and they have done a very legitimate job in covering a certain medication and designing a formulary with perhaps even our best interests at heart, it's not realistic for me to go around it because the prices have become so inflated because of this kickback scheme that is now in place. And so you could argue that the prices have gotten so out of whack that it is ridiculous to assume that a patient could ever purchase it outside of benefits coverage.
All right, Antonio Ciaccia, who is, again, the founder of 3 Axis Advisors and 46 Brooklyn Research. We talked a lot. You've provided a lot of information. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. And so we do need to have you back. But first of all, tell people that are listening to this show would probably be most interested in going to 46 Brooklyn Research to get information that's understandable about how this works. Where do they go?
Yeah, my recommendation would be to go to 46brooklyn.com. That's where we have all of our public-facing data analytics, dashboards, and research meant for, let's say, it's not definitely, I wouldn't characterize it as layperson, but it's more accessible, I think, to the general public than other drug pricing research that you'll find.
Okay, well, I can't overemphasize the importance of getting more knowledge, and hopefully with more knowledge, gives people not only access and understanding, but maybe they'll have some impact on their legislators, which we haven't been able to talk about, to get some greater transparency. I want to thank you, Antonio, for being on the show today. It's been a pleasure and very illuminating. And I hope you'll come
Mark.
back.
Great to be with you.
Again, I hope you will come back because there's much more to cover. But thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.